I'm Dr. Gabriel Velez. I'm the faculty director on this project, but I'm really excited that they're here and they're going to really lead the way on much of this presentation. Our work is coming out of a particular center at Marquette that's called the Center for Urban Research, Teaching and Outreach. If you actually decide to sort of look or check out some of the other workshops going on right now, one of them is another one from that same center. So that center does a lot of work that touches on intersections of poverty, the Milwaukee community as well. And our project is called the Black and Latino Ecosystem and Support Transition Hub, so the Blessed Hub. And so what we're eventually trying to do with this work is to build out a space at Marquette where we have a physical space where we bring organizations and families and students themselves into Marquette to try and help create synergy and try and help build some resources there to support young Black and Latinx students in Milwaukee-area. Our mission, as I sort of laid out, this is kind of a little bit of repetition, but to kind of highlight it. One is to build this map of the ecosystem, which we're going to talk through and show you. And the second is to provide logistical information and catalytic. And what we mean by that is really engendering grant applications, helping support the good work that others are doing. Because our goal is not really to replicate or replace the efforts that are going on, but rather try and identify, highlight, and make connections across them. That's our general overlaying mission. So I'm going to hand it off here to Saul to talk a little bit about some of the inequities in higher education access and some of that data.
Thank you, Dr. Velez. Again, my name is Saul Lopez. I am a Milwaukee native. I am in my second year of my PhD program in the Educational Policy and Leadership. And today I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the background data that's been informing this project, some statistics that are important regarding higher education, the K through 12 system, just because we want to know where our students are coming from. I will provide some of that data. Next slide, please. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, across the higher ed sphere, there was a couple of barriers that were limiting our students of color here in Wisconsin of entering institutions. So in fact, Wisconsin has one of the worst educational achievement gaps in the nation. And as you can see from the graphs here above, white students graduate at higher rates than Black and Hispanic students. So if you look at the graphs, it's 94.5% compared to 71, looking at white and Black. And then Hispanic on the very left is 84%, so 10 to 20% percentages. So along with this, college completion is another issue that was already a problem before COVID. So around 1 in 3 Latino students were graduating within 6 years from the UW system. And then 1 in 5 Black students were graduating from the UW system compared to 1 in 2 white students. And that's within the UW system. So UW Milwaukee, Madison, Eau Claire, and all those institutions. Next slide, please. And there's also been a couple of efforts that I would like to highlight because we are not alone in this issue. There are efforts and initiatives throughout the city that have also started tackling the issue of access of higher education. Some of the initiatives that I'd like to highlight are the following. Moonshot for leave you with 2 final points, and that's that just in the first year of the COVID pandemic, enrollment has been going down 2.5%, like I had already mentioned. And at a more local level, recently through the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, it was reported that the completion rate for FAFSA has dropped 7% statewide and 15% in Milwaukee. So now we're sitting at 46% for the state and 47% for Milwaukee from 2020 to 2021 alone. So these are some of the statistics that have been informing our work and that are important to know when working with students and with this project. So I will pass it along to Dr. Velez again. Thank you.
Thank you, Saul. And I just want to kind of highlight with this about the pandemic and this inequities. This is not new news to folks, right? If you're in the Milwaukee area, these higher education access gaps are something that people have long been aware of. And partly we mentioned the other initiatives because there are efforts to kind of address these. And again, what we're trying to do is kind of show some connection across efforts and try and make connections between maybe the smaller community organizations that are doing important work, but in a very targeted way. And then some of what we laid out, which are these kind of broader ones, bringing together big institutions in the city and see how we can both recognize that this is not only unjust, but it's also lasting, right? This is something that has been happening over time. It's built up over time. Its roots are over time, right? This doesn't happen overnight. The pandemic has made it has exasperated it, but at the same time, it has long-standing roots here, and so it's difficult to make change. So what we've been doing with the first step is we've been trying to map it. So we've been trying to say, okay, a first step in even trying to figure out what might be going on is understanding what the supports and organizations and the resources look like. And we've created sort of an ecosystem map that we're going to touch on in a little bit more detail and show you in a second. And our goal with this is to better understand the strengths and needs of Black and Latina students, as well as the supports present at points of transition in their lives. So we're taking this from a stance of saying, we understand that these inequities, we know there's this gap, but we want to focus on what are their needs, what are their strengths, but also what is the work being done, right? What kind of supports are there? So when you have a student who, let's say, is in a low-income area of Milwaukee, and they're reaching, let's say, sophomore, junior year in high school, right? What are the organizations that could be offering them types of support? How do they access those? What are they going to need for the next number of years in their life if they want to access higher education? And then thinking ahead to their employment as well, to their career, right? And so trying to get a sense of what are all the actors working in that space before we then think about, well, what are the best practices? What are the gaps? What can we do to help that and support that? One sort of note, we focus here in some of our work on transitions, and that's because in the transitions is where a lot of young people are lost. And so that's the transition from middle to high school, from high school to post-secondary education, and then also from post-secondary to career or to employment. And it's in that work, I think, that some of the resources and supports in the Milwaukee and its community are what we really want to highlight. So how can we really support young people during those points of transition? So the work itself, so there are 5 things that I kind of want to just touch on and highlight that we've been doing. The first is systematically compiling a list of organizations. So if we're going to get any sense of what's going on in this space, what this inequity is about, we need to understand who's doing the work, right? And so that's been meeting with folks, that's been calling them, that's been looking on websites and trying to compile that information. The second part of that, as I just sort of touched on, was really the meeting, because, you know, as we all know, face to face, and I'll put that in quotes just because in the pandemic that's been a lot of virtual, but actually connecting with folks who are doing work and hearing from them and talking with them is both really important for us to learn about who is doing this work, but also to hear from the people who are doing the work and what are their lessons, what are their takeaways. And we're going to share a little bit of that in a second. The last, or the third thing is that we've tried to catalog. So based on those conversations, we're trying to catalog and create some sort of database, essentially, of this information, of what we're hearing from them. What are the challenges? What are the strengths? What work are they doing? And then also this key part to think about, what are the partnerships? Because part of the idea of an ecosystem is that no school, no organization is operating entirely by itself, right? They're linked into other organizations. Those organizations are linked into others. So we're trying to understand what those connections are, to understand also what the needs are and who's sort of central actors in this and how we can support that work. A fourth part is sort of this disseminating and a cycle of building up a visualization of all this. So taking what we kind of learned through this 1 through 3, trying to create a visual map, which again, we'll show you in a second, and I know, highlighting that, but then continually updating it and continually sharing it with folks out there in the community to get feedback, but also to see how is this going to be useful? What can we do with it? How can we develop it? And some future points of development. We want to take this work, and eventually we're going to get to a point where we're going to be looking to try and identify what are gaps and then what are also some best practices. And we really want to do this from a very humble perspective. We're not here to say, like, we know what's going on, we understand this completely, let's tell you about it. But rather, based on what we're hearing from the folks we're meeting with, from the folks doing this work, we're going to try and compile sort of an understanding of what we're hearing and present that back out. And then also see how we can support getting more resources to address those gaps or to bolster and amplify those best practices. And then also in our map, we want to add other elements, because right now we're focusing, as I mentioned here, on these kind of aspects, but there are others that are important to consider. One is geographical location. So right now we've kind of mapped this out, but the fact is, if you live in certain areas of Milwaukee, you're going to have more community organizations or more supports than others. And that's not a consideration we really have in what we're doing yet, but we understand that that's important and we want to get there. Okay, oops, it looks like it's frozen. There we go. Is your part or... Okay, so yeah, sorry, let me take one step back here. I think it's missing one little slide there, but So in the 5 branches of our work, so off of those kind of goals, what we've been doing is dialoguing with these organizations, activists and institutional actors, the mapping of the ecosystem, which we've created through this software called Kumu. So we have a whole presentation and we're going to share links after for folks to explore it. But it essentially kind of looks like this in like a static photo. And so it's taking all these organizations, mapping them out, and you'll see the lines are the connectors, and each one of those dots is a different organization. So we've grouped them and we've categorized them. So some are government entities, some are connected to business, some are connected to K-8 academics or high school academics. And we're trying to show what each of these organizations is, but then again, who they're connected to. And so if you were to go and click on one of these dots, it would give you some information about that organization. It would tell you a little bit about it, give you a link to their website, but then also it would show you who they're connected to. And we're even adding an element on what those connections look like. So is that a partnership where one organization is funding another, where one is providing services, where one is doing advocacy, those type of things. And so this information, again, is something that's public facing. And so folks can go in here and just explore this and use this for themselves. A third thing we're doing is engaging in some targeted research projects that are connected to this whole idea. So off of one project, I just want to highlight 2 quotes. And what we did for this work was we went into some of the post-secondary institutions around Milwaukee, and we talked to some of the students there about what it's like to be a student on their campus, but in Milwaukee. So how the context of Milwaukee, how this ecosystem is informing their experience on campus. So for instance, one of the students said, so when my school is saying that these neighborhoods are dangerous, they're also saying that these people are dangerous. And so what they were highlighting there was that the way that their university talked about Milwaukee and talked about certain neighborhoods and the people there was conveying messages to them too about those type of people. And if they felt like they were those type of people or they came from areas of Milwaukee themselves, they were saying the school is saying I'm dangerous, that I'm a problem, right? That this is partly me. And it was creating these barriers in how the school talked about Milwaukee as a city. A second quote here, which examples some other perspectives, was not speaking of Milwaukee as a whole, but just my community, I would say united. What I was able to see growing up on this side of town was how resourceful all of the families are. So one student, right, was talking about their experience of Milwaukee as being something different than a lot of other students, because they were saying other students are saying it's segregated. I'm saying it's united. That was my experience growing up. And so this is just to sort of show like how the experiences of Milwaukee are informing these students on their post-secondary campuses, right? Just because they're at Marquette or UWM or MATC doesn't mean that they're entirely in a bubble separated from Milwaukee. We have to be thinking about that ecosystem more broadly. A fourth thing we've been doing is trying to interpret, analyze, and understand some of the data, so some of the metrics and measurements. What we presented to you before are some of that, but when we're looking at just pure numbers like who's graduating or who's getting to college, right, we're missing a lot of things in between. We're missing how young people experience it. We're missing what does it mean? How do they access resources that are out there? What are the resources they don't have? So we're trying to get into that in a little bit more detail. And then the last thing we're starting to do is a little bit of programming as well. And so this is just to highlight a program that was done before the pandemic at Marquette, and then we're taking back up, which is called the Leadership and Brotherhood Summit. And so it's an opportunity where we worked in conjunction with the Black and Latino Male Achievement Office through MPS. And we bring a number of young people for a day-long retreat at Marquette, and we have workshops and we have speakers, and we talk through what it means to them to be kids of color in Milwaukee and what kind of supports they need. And so this is sort of part of our programming efforts that particularly as we sort of move out of the pandemic or out of the most restricting times in the pandemic, that we're going to try and build up as well. From here, I'm going to hand it off to Veronica to talk a little bit about some of the key takeaways from all this work that we've done.
Thank you. My name is Veronica. I was actually born and raised in Ecuador. I came in '96, so I've been here. I'm an old-timer immigrant. I came to Milwaukee in 2007 with my 2 children at the time. Now they are growing. So I have 2 males. One is a sophomore at UW-Madison, and the other one is a senior at Rufus King. They went to schools here. So they went to Kosciuszko in the South Side when it was a Montessori bilingual dual language school. Then they went to Highland Community School, where I also worked. And then they went to King, both of them. Another group of people that have heavily impacted who I am and how I operate in the world, other than my sons, have been my students. So I have been a teacher for many years in Milwaukee since 2007, and I've taught from K through 12, and now I have the opportunity of teaching at the college level. Like Saul, I'm also in a PhD program. I'm on my 3rd year of PhD, and my research interest is the development of teachers of color, and specifically the pedagogies that they bring into the classroom. So that's a little bit of a background. As Gabriel was saying, would you mind putting the slide where we had the picture of here's the teacher in me. Oh. The picture of Kumu. There you go. Okay, so as Gabriel was saying, we began with a list of organizations that were compiled by a graduate, a master's group of students from Marquette. And then we would call, in this case, we have Curto here. So we would take an organization and call them. At that point, we knew sort of the website kind of information, right? Maybe it was an organization that we had a personal connection with. So I would like call my friend. And then we have a conversation about who are their partners, right? So what's your organization? How do you serve youth of color? And that's the focus always. And then tell me about your partnerships. And then conversations come up. And I strongly believe that through dialogue, we learn and we all grow. So conversations come up about, well, what do you mean by partnership? Well, I don't want to tell you what I mean. What do you mean? What's a partner to you? And then takeaways come up. So now we can go to the takeaways. So there are 5 main takeaways so far. As we've had these conversations, generally Saul and I then met. I'm like, no, this is what people are saying. This is what people are saying. What do we hear? What are the patterns? So across the conversations, these are the things that seem to come up when we talk to youth worker, people that work with youth, organizations that have a dedicated service to youth. So there's 5 of them. The first one is they love the map. We show them the map and then they're like, wow, right? Because you can filter things, you can highlight things. They find it very useful. And often they're like, oh, how could we use this for grants? Like this might be able to help us to get some grants. The second thing has to do with people of color in leadership roles in nonprofits. And the questions that have always come up is why is there such a high rate of burnout among persons of color in leadership? And that causes then a high turnaround rate in Milwaukee of leadership of people of color for initiatives for youth that are Black and brown. So then we have this revolving door of leaders. Why does that happen? Why is it happening in Milwaukee? The third takeaway has to do with like, what do we understand as success? So I'm speaking with this person and, well, how do you measure success? Well, what is success? And how does that differentiate from what a grant, how they want you to measure success? And when there's a disconnect, a grant that we receive needs this measurable outcome. But really what I think the young people need is their measure of success would be different. It's a qualitative outcome, like self-regulation. How do you measure self-regulation of emotions? How do you measure dreaming, feeling that you can achieve, right? I received a young person that was like, life sucks and there's no future for me. And now they're like, I can be this. How do you measure that? So when there's a gap between what is success for me in working with these young people or this group of young people, but the grant requires me to measure these things in another way, what gets lost? What gets obscured? Right? What do I need to, what can't I include in the grant to tell them about these great accomplishments I had because they're not measurable? So that was definitely this is a big thing for the organizations that we've spoken with. How do we understand success? How do grants understand success? And how are they asking us to measure it? The fourth takeaway, it has to do with the impact of segregation in these organizations. So how does geographical location impact the services that young people receive? And then the fifth thing has to do with interracial relationships and trust. How does trust or lack thereof among Black, brown, and white leaders offers possibilities as well as limits the services and quality that youth receive? So if I am struggling to communicate with my leader and I'm working with youth, and I'm understanding race and racism I have a specific lens for race and racism. It's systematic. These are things that, it's about power, but my leader is thinking differently. How does that disconnect then directly impact my ability to stay within the organization, my willingness to stay in the organization, and how I'm serving the youth? Right. So these are the 5 takeaways that we've had. One of the things about the map itself and these conversations is that I'm not sure if I'm going to say this word right, iterative. Like it's continually changing, right? Like all living things that flow and move and change. So at every stage, something new is added, something is revised. And now I'm going to pass it. Oh, now we're having a discussion. Now I'm going to pass the mic to you. All right. So we have a few questions. You need the mic. She needs the mic.
I have a question, online question. What features must an ecosystem have to be balanced?
So I saw that question, and when I was looking at the takeaways, and I wrote the question down, and what the leaders of organizations have shared with us is in the partnerships, they're mutually beneficial partnerships. Like these are like, there's no money exchange. We don't depend on money to have a relationship. I'm on organization A, you're organization B. I send you my young people, you lend me your space, and we help each other that way. When there is funding, then it's not per se a sustainable relationship. We're only staying in relationship as long as you're funding me or I'm funding you. So that is the one thing I thought of, is the mutually beneficial relationships has come out of these conversations. Are there other questions?
Do we have questions from anybody in the room? Okay, well, I have a question. I paid attention to looking at the lack of trust with the Black and brown leaders. Going through education in Milwaukee, because I'm from Milwaukee and I went to an MPS school, I learned that over the years, starting high school, they had more resources for seniors that were leaving. Colleges came in to visit them. The counselors were more active. They spent time with them. They taught them how to fill out FAFSA. They had colleges speak to them, figure out where they wanted to go and what they want to do. When I got to be a senior, we no longer had that. We lacked all those resources. There were nothing. I learned how to do FAFSA alone, at home, after graduation, which is June, knowing that FAFSA cutoff time is January. We just didn't have, no colleges came in to visit us. Like the inner city schools had a big disconnect, and all of the leaders who were pushing for us to go to college, pushing for us to get higher education or go into a trade, they were now retired. So we didn't have the necessary resources in MPS schools for us to move forward. So how do you guys work to implement that, to bring it back into the school system, maybe to help our future now?
I can speak a little bit to that. There are a couple things there I think that are really great points. And one is exactly what you laid out, is why this is like a living ecosystem, right? Because in one moment, there was this support and resources, and then that changed within a couple of years. And so that's, again, like we recognize with what we're doing, and just in general, things can change rapidly, right? If we looked 2 or 3 years ago, we would know there were issues with higher education access, but they would look very different than they look right now, coming out of the pandemic and what's gone on in the last 2 years. So I think that really speaks to that. In terms of that with school systems, so we work with a number of different partners. And so I would say that like this map and these organizations we've talked to, this is trying to get a broad sense of the entire spectrum. But we do have some like really key partners, and we have a community advisory board, and some of the folks tap into that. So one of the main ones is the Black and Latino Male Achievement Office at MPS. Also some folks at UWM, MATC. There are a couple others. Carmen Schools is a really close partner. And so some of the work we're doing is more tightly with those groups to try and get some of this and get what we're finding, sort of that opening that conversation. So having that inform our work and trying to get that into the schools. One of the things we do recognize is one of our tightest partners, who I've now mentioned twice, is the Black and Latino Male Achievement Office, right? And so they're doing particularly work with male youth. Now that's exclusive to some degree, right? I mean, that's separating out a large number of folks. And one of the constant conversations we have is really a question about intersectionality, where it's saying, okay, so Black male youth in Milwaukee, yes, there are particular challenges and particular needs they have. And that is making it homogeneous across class, across geographic location. That's also exclusive, because that is leaving out Black female youth who are in these similar situations and facing these similar challenges. And so part of what our challenges with this is figuring out how to address all of those complexities. And to be quite honest, like what you just described in that perspective is something that's missing here. What we've done is we've talked to organizations, we've talked to schools and school partners, but we're getting it from their perspective, right? So just the story that you told from that school's perspective probably looked differently, right? And we want to make sure we're getting the youth voice. So this year we're doing a lot more work to try and get young people's perspective. And one of the things I'm excited about is we're on the very beginning stages, but of getting an initiative together where we're going to try and get young people to show us, what does this look like to you? Like, how do you think of this ecosystem? How do you understand it? What's your experience of it? And hopefully we'll get stories like that out of it. And then because we've built all these connections and worked with so many organizations, we're going to bring those stories and those perspectives to them as well, right? And so trying to make that clearer. Beyond that, I mean, the other difficulty that we face, but it's just, I think, true in general, is the school systems have so many bureaucratic hurdles as well, right? And I know a lot of folks who can identify. I was speaking with someone recently who works in one of these organizations, and they do mental health work. And they were saying, look, we're ready to offer this, evidence-based intervention. We want to get it into all these schools. I think they even have, funding sources and opportunities, and they're really struggling right now because MPS has certain rules and regulations and ways of doing things that are inhibiting that access. So I think it's also the last point I'll just sort of mention is, I've talked about, we call this a hub, our work. So we call it like the blessed hub. Right now we have no physical space that we use, but our hope is eventually to take that space and make it a place too where young people who are not getting those supports and resources in their schools can come and get some of that from us. I mean, one of the benefits of being Marquette is we are a predominantly white private institution with a lot of resources and privilege attached to that. And we want to think about how we can use that thoughtfully to help fill some of these gaps. So we don't want to step in on the groups doing this kind of work, but if there are, if we're hearing that there are a lot of young people who need FAFSA support, we can provide support, we can provide ways to help get that to them. And that's what we're hoping eventually with the physical space. But we don't want to start by saying, we know what's wrong, we know what we're going to do. We want to listen and hear and get the perspectives. Is there another question? Great.
Is there any questions in the room? Okay, this is a question online. How do we navigate through these type of issues? Meaning the ecosystem. Mm-hmm.
I actually was hoping you can help us with that. It's a really good question. How I personally, so this would be my personal belief is we start by getting to know each other, by dialoguing. This is what we see. This is the struggles we find. What does Milwaukee look like to us, the people that are working on the ground? So I think it's key to get that. So I would love to ask I have questions for you that I would love for you to talk to each other and then share with us. Could I put that out? For sure.
Okay, I have one more question. Well, kind of a question, kind of a statement. How do we bridge the gap of keeping our inner city students to attending universities like Marquette? Because I've learned that as a student, we didn't choose to stay home in Wisconsin because at the schools that we're in, they're what we call them PWI, but predominantly white institutions. And I went to an HBCU. So we didn't have comfortable spaces to be in, to be ourselves, to express ourselves. Yeah, they have the Black Student Union, but it's the Black Student Union, but it's like, yeah, you really can't, you have to be politically correct when you do everything. You can't, there was no comfortable space for us to be in, which made a lot of us go south and go to HBCUs. My issue is how to bridge the gap to keep the kids here. Because technically going to an in-state school is cheaper than going out of state. So it's like we rather keep our mental and our sanity and attend a school that's predominantly Black than to, say going to a predominantly white institution. Like, how do we bridge our gap to keep our students here to grow our ecosystem within Milwaukee?
Thank you for your question. I have a couple of thoughts. I think that I was an undergrad student at Marquette. And when I started, Marquette became, or its mission, um, it adopted a new goal to become a Hispanic serving institution, which means to have 25% of its student body be Hispanic and half of that be from lower income households. This week, we surpassed 15%, so we became an emerging HSI. So that's been a jump of, I think, 6 to 7% almost. I am not super sure about that. So 15%. So it's taken some time, 5 to 6 years, but that implementation has come through a lot of offices, a lot of collaboration. Again, going to Veronica's point, dialogue and sitting in those meetings and working with great minds and working with great students to kind of come up with programming efforts, coming with detailed goals so we can hit. It's a process, right? And I know that last year through amazing student activism, Marquette also is now offering 40 scholarships through the Urban Scholars Program, and they have given 40 of those for Milwaukee students. And we have also opened a living, yes, for undergraduate students now at Marquette. We've also opened a living learning community for Black students. It's housed in the Humphrey Hall, I think. And then we have a Nuestro Hogar, which is another living learning community for Hispanic students or with Hispanic with the theme of familia, housed in Straz. So there's been these efforts. I think that we are more, we know of them because we're working within Marquette. So I think that externally, there is that probably need to inform the community. So these are my thoughts.
I'll just speak from a mother perspective of somebody who went to college and is a sophomore and a senior now going into college. I think the solution is complex, right? It's multi-layered. We need the organizations, we need our youth within colleges to demand what is rightfully rightfully a right, to demand what is necessary to create those spaces. The larger those spaces are, the more an institution can transform. So that's one. What Saul was talking about. It was the Black Student Union who mobilized, who demanded, and who got the scholarships. So that is one way, right? The other area or level I'm thinking is, how do we prepare our youth to face a world that is different than what they're accustomed to? Right. So until we get those safe spaces, and again, this is my mom, the mother inside of me, the perspective of a mother, until those spaces are created, how are we in our churches, in our nonprofit organizations, within our families, preparing our youth for a world that looks very different than the high schools they're going to? And I think that is critical for the youth that now are going to college next year. So that's like the short term. How is this person who maybe Black, Latinx, Hmong, Indigenous, mixed, going into a predominantly white school, in my son's case, Madison, what are they taking with them that's going to help them protect themselves, protect their health, their mental health, and not succumb to the pressure and the racism existent there? And I think that would be like a great question, right? So if I can go into the handout I just gave you, what we would love to hear from you is, what do you see? So what strength or challenge do you see that our youth have? So in the first part is identifying this is our youth are multicultural, right? They're bilingual, multilingual. They speak different types of English. These are the strengths. They're resourceful. These are strengths and challenges. So we would like you to identify strengths and challenges. Tell us, why do you feel in your work with youth and your knowledge of youth, why are these strengths or challenges? Tell us, please, what resources already exist that build off of these strengths or support the development of factors that will be protective to the challenges. And then what do you see as a pending need? Like where is there a gap? What do you see as a need that we still have? Yes, ma'am.
Oh, well, let's take like a couple minutes. We would love for you to write this down. We may even collect it after, not to hold you accountable, but because this is honestly what feeds the work that we do. I just know one thing under this, what resources or supports, if you know of organizations, like if you're thinking of like, hey, this is this school or this church or this community, like please do write that in here. And again, this is going to be informative for us, and we'll also further the conversation. So maybe it'll take a couple minutes for you just to kind of think and write some thoughts down, and then we can share for the last couple minutes. And for the people online, we'll have this document along with the resources and follow-up for this. And so we would love if you contribute. For right now, you can see the slide. And so if there are any thoughts you have for any of these columns, feel free in the chat where you're putting questions to just throw in your thoughts and responses, and we'll be checking on them up here.